The title is "It's My Party and I'll Die If I Want to: The Carnivalesque and the Inevitability of the Anti-Mask Movement." So I'm now going to share my screen. To be aware, I actually have a lot of slides that cover most of my thing, but I'll go through them quickly. They're various things, and I take a sort of historical approach to the anti-mask movement now, as opposed to what other people have been doing. So here we go.
Great, that's working fine.
Great. And slideshow from the beginning. Great, I have not ended the meeting yet. So anyway, thank you, Jordan, a former student of mine, and Fivers and Steph and everybody else, and thank you for the screen sharing. So many wonderful talks here. I want to make this brief and make a few points, even though I begin in 1730. This is a longer piece I'm working on for Boston Review about the anti-mask movement. And I want to begin with just this image. It's a 1926 Christian tract against modernity, essentially. And it sort of sets the stage for what I want to talk about, which is the different trends in American culture that have actually led to this moment here. Obviously, I want to acknowledge, as we all have, that my writing and the thinking that's taking place now is taking place during the 2020 election, which is, and the Trump presidency, which is, of course, literally the elephant in the room. It's also taking place through a tremendous, I'm clicking too soon here, expedient rise of post-truth culture and increasingly a rejection of science, however we want to define that, right? The anti-science mindset takes multiple forms. I mean, just 2 days ago, right, President Trump said that doctors were over-reporting COVID cases to make money. A post-truth fact that he probably doesn't believe, but many of his followers might, right? This is all inseparable from the larger tapestry and context of American history and politics. So the anti-vaxxer movement in America begins with smallpox vaccine. It starts in the mid 19th century, even a little bit earlier, and its newest incarnation really begins in the early 1980s. And the national conservative movements, right, against acquiring knowledge about reproduction and sex have been in existence, right, since the social purity movements in the 1870s, right? But they have really taken on new life. I'm talking about the fight against sex ed in schools, right? They've really taken new life and flourished since the 1950s, but certainly since the 1970s, right? So here we have a anti-sex ed poster that equates it with child abuse, porn education, transgenderism, and another one referring to, say no to radical sex ed, by which they just mean regular sex ed, right? So I don't know whether people in America or in the UK know, but 43 states still have some form of injunction against teaching sex education in public schools. And certainly private schools there are hardly any public schools that actually have any mandate to actually teach what we would call sex education. I think in the broader context, right, it's been 95 years, I believe, in a few months, since the world famous Scopes trial called the Monkey Trial in Tennessee, which brought up the teaching of evolution in public schools. Here's an image of the Anti-Evolution League, right, the conflict between Hell and Heaven High School. And it's quite interesting that evolution is now taught in most public schools, but 15 states teach it along with creationism, and many more states have bills planning to do that. These are mostly in the South and some in the Midwest. A 2014 Gallup poll found that 42% of Americans believe that humans were created by God 10,000 years ago. A further 31% believe in evolution, but under God's guidance, and only 19% believe that God had nothing to do with evolution. So this notion of evolution, of the teaching of evolution, the teaching of science, right, moves into the realm of the fantasy. Here's a rather famous cartoon from the Monkey Trials, the Scopes trials, right? And it's of William Jennings Bryan on the left, Clarence Darrow, the lawyer, defending the teacher on the right, and the monkey in between, right, using the quote from Macbeth, "When shall we three meet again?" obviously moving into the realm of a supernatural discussion. And the notion of climate change is far too big, has to be mentioned here, but it's far too big to actually go into. But it's one of the most obvious forms of science denial. What people may not realize is that James G. Watt, the Secretary of the Interior under Ronald Reagan, a devout evangelical Christian, was quoted in the Washington Post in 1981 that my responsibility is to follow the scripture which calls upon us to occupy the land until Jesus returns. He was quoted in the Washington Post again, although this is in dispute. He allegedly told a US Congress that protecting natural resources was unimportant in the light of the imminent return of Jesus Christ. And he said during public testimony, after the last tree is felled, Christ will come back. So I want to talk a little bit about the logic, what I see as the logic of the anti-mask movement, right? And the contemporary anti-mask movement is really the result, I think, of longstanding trends in American culture, and to a large degree, growth of a very particular and very American strain of evangelical Christianity, which I'll admit changes over time. But there's a certain trend within it, which I think stays somewhat constant. This is actually, America's gone through 4 great religious revivals. This is the picture of the first one in 1730, which is before the Revolution. And there are other revivals called the Great Awakenings. The first one's 1830, 1730, then 1790, 1850, and the last was in the 1970s, right? And all of these happened during a time of some social upheavals. And I think we need to look at these religious awakenings in conjunction, right, with what Richard Hofstadter, the American historian, calls the paranoid style in American politics. It's an essay he wrote in 1964 and later became a book. Here's his quote: "The paranoid statesman sees the fate of conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. He traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. He's always manning the barricades of civilization. He constantly lives at a turning point. Like religious millennialists, he expresses the anxiety of those who are living through the last days, and he is sometimes disposed to see the date for the apocalypse." I think Hofstadter actually points out, I have to note, that this could happen on the right or on the left, although I think we see it more on the right. And he traces this back to the theological separation in the heart and in the theological separations of the heart and the mind, which is at the root of most strains of American Protestantism. And he sees the beginning of the modern paranoid style as starting in the 1880s with the populist movements, rural movements, the agrarian movements that mistrusted the urban modern sensibility, right? So this comes to this conflict comes into fruition in the 1920s with the rise of the expert in American culture, the emergence of a much broader and comprehensive public university system, with advances in science that were happening at the time. This is all happening, right? And also, interestingly, right, at the 19th Amendment, which is the suffrage amendment too, right? So all of this reinforces the idea that there's an elite and the overwhelming power of modernity, which is obviously seen as a crushing power by those who are not in favor of it. By the 1970s and the Fourth Awakening, which people will realize was actually the rise of Jerry Falwell, the rise of Pat Robertson, the rise of Nita Bryant, and the anti-gay referendums in Florida as well as California. This tension leads to enormous conflicts between the populace and the elite, right? And we see this, there's a group by Jerry Falwell Sr., not Jerry Falwell Jr., who's just fired from his university, right? Here's a cover of their report about AIDS, right? And we see this with the religious right, right? And there are attacks upon environmentalism and science in general. There are worries about the decline of family values, and worries about the liberation movements for non-white groups, for women, and for sexual minorities, right? And I think this all sets the stage for the anti-mask movement, you know, the logic of the anti-mask movement really draws its inspiration from popular religious and social trends of anti-science, a rejection of the elites, which we hear from the president all the time, and from the Republican Party for the most part, from the leaders, the disdain for the expert, and particularly the scientist and the doctor, as we just saw with the attacks on Dr. Fauci this morning, and a mindset, right, that could be called paranoid, although people in the movement would actually call it resisting unlawful authority. So it is generally traditionalist, I think is a word that's more accurate than conservative, in matters of limiting, not expanding citizenship, of maintaining what they see as race purity, the stability of sexual identity and the status quo, although not necessarily sexual behavior in their private lives, and resisting any government controls. Right, so here we see some anti-mask. I have more anti-mask posters later on. So as I've been thinking about this over the past few months, through a series of talks I had given in different places, I began to think about the notion of the Carnivalesque and the phrase, the world turns upside down. I kept coming back to this and the concept of misrule. I don't know whether people are familiar with this. Misrule is a medieval European tradition, it exists today in different ways, that certain times in the annual calendar, the social order was turned upside down, right? The king became the pauper became the king, the town was ruled by the lord of misrule or the abbot of misrule. This actually is a poster for about, a lithograph from about 1550. You'll see that the man in the center is actually cross-dressed. Right. Often during these times, often forbidden sexual behavior was allowed, as was excessive drinking, excessive jokes, pranks, and outlandish behavior. Right. So basically, the sacred became the profane, and the strict rules of piety and respect for official notions of the sacred were stripped of their power. So blasphemy, obscenity, debasings were common, and they were a celebration rather than being condemned as earthly and bodily based. Right, we see the lingering effects of these holidays in Halloween, April Fool's Day, as well as Mardi Gras here in the U.S. In terms of wassailing back a little bit a century ago in the U.K., Fasching in Germany, or even Purim in these certain aspects of Judaism. Right, so the idea of misrule was incorporated into cultural studies. I think of Mikhail Bakhtin's Rebels in His World, or Terry Castle's Masquerade and Civilization, the Carnivalesque in 18th century English culture. And the phrase associated with misrule is the world turned upside down, which is a quote from the prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible. Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, and make it to waste, and turneth it upside down, and scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. So in most of the modern literature and writing about the Carnivalesque and misrule, these were seen as actually liberating. They're a relief from repression. It's also located in the region, I would argue, the region of the uncanny, in that it's strangely familiar, and it locates the strange within the familiar. But I also think it's important to really emphasize, right, that in doing so, it highlights in some way the power and the reality of the ordinary, right? It's used to actually, it actually ends up highlighting that rather than obscuring it, right? The mask doesn't hide the person masked so much as it heightens the reality of what is being hidden. So at first I was attracted to this idea because of the role of the mask, right? The mask has been used throughout culture. The mask is used as a disguise, as a way to alter reality and to escape into a different reality and performance. You have the role of the mask in Greek theater to hide the person but accentuate the role. The tradition of the court mask in English in 16th and 17th, the English court culture of performances. Obviously, the Guy Fawkes mask, which I believe is coming up very soon. And of course, would now become the leftist anonymous mask, or the masks of Halloween, right? So the mask is traditionally associated with the hidden, with the occult, with the object, and generally with things that go bump in the night, right? And it has almost magical power to transform reality. So in many ways, it can be a form of resistance. So I thought this was actually a very interesting poster. I just based on the Barbara Kruger style of art of using the red and the black and the white lettering. I then became, in my thinking, I became intrigued, right, by the idea that the mask that once hid that hid the faces was now providing safety, right? That it did not hide a face to provoke, but to secure it. That a mask was calming and not scary. That it protected the person and did not hint at mischief or at mystery. And in some ways, I saw this as a really ironic reversal, right? It's sort of a new form of misrule that provided security in an unsecure world, right? It normalizes the world that had been turned upside down, right? And this is what the new rule of mask wearing does to people who actually wear masks, right? But those are not the people who are in the anti-mask movement, right? And I was thinking this through. I realized that I was in the world of Bakhtin and of cultural studies, and that the notion of misrule and of the Carnivalesque and the Carnivalesque, right? Obviously not the world of the mask refusers, right? They were living in a world in which the Carnivalesque symbolized and actually was they are not living in the world in which the Carnivalesque symbolized or actually was a relief from social repression or arbitrary rules or illogical social strictures, right? They're living in the world of the original quote from Isaiah, which is the 4 verses in book 22, right? And Isaiah is not in favor of misrule. He's not in favor of the world to turn upside down. He literally says, in number 5, the earth is also defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant. So what many people celebrate in the more enlightened world of reason, what many people celebrate in the enlightened world of reason, equality, and knowledge, right? The logical extension of the Enlightenment project, right? The anti-mask wearers experience very differently. Many aspects of modernity are a nightmare. Science is not just elitist, but it's anti-biblical and anti-religion. Changing ideas about equality, about race, about sexuality and gender have dislocated their sense and the correct, proper sense in their view of what is proper within the universe, right? So literally the world has been turned upside down in a betrayal of biblical and religious imperatives, right? It is literally a nightmare. And there's actually little that they can actually do practically against this inevitable progress, or it seems inevitable. I guess we'll see on Tuesday. But there are other factors in this as well, right? Within the U.S., shifts in the U.S. economy over the past 3 decades have upended people's sense of security. This is the big Trump thing about bringing coal back, even though we know that we will not be needing coal because we have other forms of energy. America has never come to any actual reckoning with its racial history, and attempting to do so is in fact even more dislocating for many of these people. Violence and resentment permeate American culture, making Hofstadter's paranoid style, right, not just the background for the discussion, but actually the game plan. We had the discussion a little bit before about Trump's language, right? And all of this makes not wearing a mask in the middle of a pandemic, I believe, completely logical, right? The elites are not only to be distrusted and resented, but people to be ignored, right? But the elites are a force to be actively disobeyed. Right? Freedom matters. So we reshifted the entire discussion to freedom, not freedom from disease or freedom, but freedom from the government. I will never consent, testing, tracking, vaccines. We will not comply, right? So there's an act, much like on the left, we would see an act of resistance to the government. In an age of shifting sexual and gender norms, this means for many men, taking their cue from Trump, right, that not wearing a mask is a sign of strength and of masculinity. Literally, as somebody pointed out to me the other day, toxic masculinity. As the politics of race play a larger and larger part in the American culture, not wearing a mask means literally a display of whiteness for many people. And for many people who don't have a voice, not wearing a mask is actually just simply a way to be seen and a way to be distinctly heard. Right here we have a honk if you question coronavirus, right? All of this is a series of active oppositions to a new wave of progressive politics that have upended the mythical idea of America that they love, right? We can see of the many signs that people carry, which have been, slogans, and Jim has just mentioned this, slogans that have been appropriated from what they see as the opposition, right? So they, opposition that they label anarchists and radicals, right? So the George Floyd, Eric Gardner, I can't breathe slogan becomes no masks, I can't breathe, right? This is my body, this is my choice from pro-choice language, right, becomes not about abortion, right, but about the choice of not having a vaccine or not wearing a mask, right? So the leftist slogans, which go back to the mid 60s, right, question everything, question authority, become fighting the government that they experience as being the oppressive government, right? So I think that a good case can be made for the argument that the behaviors of the anti-vax movement, the anti-mask movement, and the refusal to socially distance, right, or the need to reopen society before it's prudent, is actually sort of inevitable. It's the results of almost 2 centuries of changing ideas about citizenship, about dominant religious beliefs, and the literal interpretation of scripture in the face of science, and an evolution of society and culture in the United States that was not only predicated on the fear of the other, but prioritized an idealized notion of personal freedom, right, which equates it with a form of personal salvation and demonizes any collective sense of identity, safety, or health as elitist and oppressive. So it's not necessarily a religious movement per se, but it's one based on faith in a non-material world, right? Here's my faith is in God, not pharma. And I think that in a world turned upside down, different for me and other people and different for them, different interpretations, this is a nightmarish carnival over which they have no control. Refusing to wear a mask is not only a symbol of resistance, but a sign of, ironically, really, a sign of survival, right? So the new sign of tyranny is actually the mask, and they will survive this. So thank you. That is, I'm going to try now to stop the share.